Senior naval officer Henry Wilkins had always felt so safe and secure in the home he called his own, and he had always felt so protected by his wife, Margaret. But that night, coming home a little earlier than usual, he felt that sense of safety start to fade. The house felt oddly quiet and a bit musty, which was very out of character for Margaret. Henry shrugged off his wet coat, hurried past the empty hallway, and climbed upstairs to the room he had always considered the cozy haven of his family. On the second floor, near the slightly ajar door of their guest bedroom, lay an object that immediately caught his attention: a tie. It wasn't his tie. Henry bent down, picked it up, and felt a cold knot begin to tighten in his chest. The tie was simple, with a striped pattern, much like the ones worn by junior officers on his ship. Stepping inside, he witnessed the ultimate betrayal. His wife, dressed in nothing but a light robe, sat on the edge of the bed next to a young sailor who was hurriedly trying to button his shirt. Margaret let out a gasp, but her eyes held no remorse, only a mix of fear and defiance. "You're back early," she said, not even attempting to offer an excuse. The young sailor, taken aback, tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Henry dropped the tie to the floor. His hands trembled, but his voice remained cold, as sharp as a steel blade. "Get out of my house," he said quietly but firmly, locking eyes with the officer. Without waiting for a second command, the young man slipped out into the hallway and disappeared. But the betrayal wasn't the worst part. Later, Henry would learn that Margaret had been using the upstairs room to rent out for special services, offering her clients far more than just a place to stay. The most heartbreaking part? She had even tried to involve their daughter, Claire. Henry stood in the dimly lit hallway, leaning against the wooden door frame. The door was rough, and it made Henry feel like he was cracked and broken too. He looked around the room, taking in every detail: the rumpled sheets on the bed, a wine glass still half full on the nightstand, and a single slipper that wasn't his. "So this is what you do while I'm risking my life far from home?" Henry stepped into the room, his voice low and almost growling. Margaret lifted her chin as if she wanted to defend herself, but her eyes showed her fear. She stood up slowly, trying to stay strong. I won't make excuses, Henry," she said, taking a hold of the edge of her robe. "You wouldn't understand anyway." "Understand?" He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. "You left a room offer," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "And then you tried to involve our daughter? Am I supposed to understand that too?" "It's not what you think," she said, her voice quivering as she took a step forward and reached her hands out toward him. "Don't come any closer," he said, raising his hand as if creating an invisible shield between them. "Who is he?" Henry nodded toward the door where the young sailor had just gone. Margaret looked away, but he noticed the slight trembling in her shoulders. "Just someone who pays," she whispered, her voice barely above a whisper. His laugh was cold and without joy, like the cracking of ice. "Are you going to sell our home now? Your body?" "Margaret, my dear, what else have you sold? Our family?" Her face showed the pain she was feeling, and she screamed, "You left me alone for months. Do you know how hard it is to be a sailor's wife? Raising children on my own? Carrying everything on my shoulders while you live your important life?" "Important?" He took a step toward her, and she instinctively stepped back. "My life, which I'm ready to give up every single day for this country, for you, for our family." Silence hung in the room like a thick fog. Outside, the rain poured down, the sound of drops hitting the roof the only thing breaking the oppressive quiet. Henry turned sharply and headed for the door, but his gaze landed on a photo sitting on the shelf, a family portrait. Him, Margaret, and their daughter Claire, smiling against the backdrop of a sunset. He remembered that day. The light sea breeze, Claire laughing as he lifted her into his arms, and Margaret looking at him with love in her eyes. He picked up the photo, and a weight settled in his chest. "How could you do this?" he asked, his voice warm but trembling. His voice, no longer tinged with anger, was now weary, as if all his strength had been taken away. "I don't know," Margaret whispered, her voice trembling. Henry carefully returned the photo to its place on the shelf and quietly left the room, not wanting to cause any more distress. His footsteps echoed against the wooden floor as he processed everything that had happened. He felt like a stranger in the house that had been his refuge for so many years. Now, he just wanted to understand where it all began and where he had missed the moment their family started to fall apart. His suspicions had started when he was on the destroyer Enterprise. Amidst the roar of the waves and the steady hum of the engines, Henry sat in the cramped officer's mess across from his old friend and crewmate, Garrett Blake. They were sipping on their thick, steaming mugs of coffee, Garrett's favorite, and their conversation meandered from the sea to life, and as often happened to women. "Henry," Garrett said, taking a big sip of his coffee, "you're a man of principles, but someday you'll want to start living for yourself too. All those years at sea, with constant deployments, don't you ever dream of just sailing off into the sunset with a beautiful woman?" Henry chuckled, shaking his head. "A beautiful woman? I already have one. Margaret and Claire are all I need. Sail into the sunset? Maybe when the Navy lets me retire." "Exactly," Garrett drawled, leaning back in his chair. "But you know, women come in all kinds." Henry raised an eyebrow, anticipating one of Garrett's famous stories. "Okay, go for it. Sounds like you've got something special to share." Garrett leaned in closer, lowering his voice as if he were about to divulge a military secret. "I heard a story recently, my friend. It was about a woman, and I'll bet you'll love her too. They say she's got a certain talent, you know what I mean?" "Another myth," Henry teased. "There's a legendary woman in every port," he added with a warm smile. No, listen," Garrett cut him off. "This one's different. They say she's not just breathtaking, but that she also has a daughter, supposedly just as beautiful. Some people say it's like the devil himself is pulling the strings to tempt sailors." "The devil?" Henry smirked. "Now you're scaring me. What's next? Do they lure sailors in and eat them for dinner?" "You're laughing," Garrett said, his face serious, though a playful glint sparkled in his eyes. "But they say this woman shows up in the towns we like to visit. I've even heard she's been spotted near our base. It's just a rumor, but a lot of the guys are really excited to meet her." Henry frowned, but he was trying not to let on how slightly irritated he was. "It's interesting how sailors have a knack for weaving tales as captivating as the high seas themselves." Garrett laughed, raising his mug to them in a friendly toast. "To dreams, my friend. They keep us afloat." But deep down, Henry felt something stirring, and he wasn't sure what to make of it. His thoughts drifted momentarily to home, to Margaret and Claire. He remembered how Margaret had changed over the years, how she had started wearing shorter skirts and had become very focused on her appearance. At the time, he thought it was just her way of holding on to her youth. But what if? He shook the thought away, clearing his head. "What's up?" Garrett noticed. "Nothing," Henry waved it off. "Just tired. I'll swing by the bridge and see how the watch is doing." "Don't worry. I'll be fine," Garrett said, his voice gentle. "We all know our women, and if we learn something new, you'll be the first to hear about it." Garrett's cheerful voice faded into the background, but his kind words lingered in Henry's mind. There was something about them that made him feel a bit uneasy. Stepping out onto the deck, he felt the strong wind and took a deep breath of the salty air. "The devil," he muttered. "Could it really just be old sailors' tales?" he wondered, gazing at the endless horizon. But he didn't know then that this legend was the story of his own family. Henry left the mess hall, still hearing Garrett's cheerful laughter in his ears, and made his way to the bridge. The cozy warmth of the deck lamps and the orderly rows of instruments brought him a sense of stability, something that often felt fleeting on land. The officers on duty saluted as he entered, and a junior lieutenant stepped forward to report. "All clear, Captain." The young officer reported that the course was steady and the weather was stable. Henry nodded in response, his eyes darting over the instrument readings. "Good. Carry on," he replied, moving toward a small porthole. Out there, the dark sea stretched out like a vast, black abyss. The moonlight touched the surface here and there, making it look calm. But Henry knew that the sea had hidden power, strong enough to topple even his mighty destroyer. His mind drifted back to his conversation with Garrett. There was something about the story that nagged at him. It might have been the part about the daughter. Henry thought of his own daughter, Claire, blonde-haired and blue-eyed, always running to meet him on the porch when he came home. She was his pride and joy, the reason he put up with everything. Long deployments, dangers, and sleepless nights. But what if? He decided to stop thinking about it. It was silly, really. Margaret had changed over the years, but that was just because time passed. Who was he to judge? He reflected. Maybe he hadn't changed as much as he thought. A life spent serving at sea, with endless deployments, could do that to a man. He squeezed his fists, gazing out at the water. "Is something wrong, sir?" The voice of Senior Lieutenant Macmillan interrupted his thoughts. Henry turned. Macmillan, a tall, lanky man with a sharp gaze, was standing a few steps away. "Henry, my friend, what's on your mind?" Henry waved him off. "Nothing. Just thinking." "It's normal to feel this way sometimes," Macmillan replied gently, his smile warm and understanding. "These waters have a way of bringing strange thoughts." "What kind of thoughts?" Henry raised an eyebrow, intrigued by his child's words. "About family, home, the people waiting for us, or not waiting." Macmillan's gaze darkened. "Sorry, sir. Just some personal thoughts." "It's all right, Mac," Henry said, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. "I think about it, too." Macmillan nodded and went back to his work, leaving Henry alone once again. The deep night enveloped the ship, only the occasional lights in the distance betraying the presence of other vessels. Henry leaned on the railing and closed his eyes, listening to the sound of the waves. A memory of Garrett's words surfaced. That woman shows up where you least expect her and leaves a trail behind. What if I'm already seeing that trail and just don't realize it? He thought. Right then, he decided that as soon as they returned to port, He would find out if everything at home was truly as it seemed. He couldn't afford to ignore his suspicions any longer. But after his fears were confirmed, his only thought was to see his daughter. Henry drove along the dark road, the headlights cutting through the wet asphalt. Rain drummed against the windshield, but he didn't turn on any music, letting his thoughts consume him. The scene in the bedroom still haunted him. Margaret's face, frozen in shock and shame, and the young man beside her, confused and vulnerable, like a rabbit before a predator. He pulled over at a small diner on the outskirts of town and ordered a coffee. Henry sat by the window and pulled out his phone. He dialed Claire's number, his daughter, who had been staying with a friend, as Margaret had claimed when he questioned why she was rarely home. "Hello?" Claire's voice sounded a bit sleepy, but brightened right away when she realized it was him. "Dad, it's me, sweetheart. Can you meet me somewhere? I need to talk to you now." There was a hint of concern in her voice. "Yes, it's important." "Okay, I'll be there soon. I'll be there soon." Henry set the phone down and took a sip of his hot coffee, feeling the weight of the situation settle heavily on his shoulders. 30 minutes later, Claire walked into the diner, shaking the rain off her umbrella. Her long blonde hair was slightly damp, but her eyes carried the same familiar expression, a mix of cautious intelligence and youthful openness. "Dad, what's going on?" she asked, sitting down across from him. He looked at her, noticing how much she had matured recently. Her eyes reminded him of her mother's, but they lacked the deceit and cold calculation he had come to associate with Margaret. "Claire," he said gently, his eyes on her hand holding his mug, "I'd love to know what's been going on with you while I was away." She froze, her face tightening. "Did she?" she started, but stopped, biting her lip. "You can tell me anything. Whatever it is, I promise I'll be on your side," he said, his tone gentle but firm. Claire lowered her gaze. "Mom, she brought Min over when you weren't home." Henry felt something inside him shatter, but he forced himself to remain calm. "I know," he said, his voice warm, "but why didn't you tell me sooner?" Claire looked up at him, tears welling in her eyes. "Because she said it was for us. For the money. That you wouldn't understand." Her voice cracked with emotion as she wiped away tears with her sleeve. "And then, she tried to talk me into it." Those words hit Henry like a slap to the face. "What?" His voice dropped low and sounded a bit menacing. "She said you could do it too? That it wasn't a big deal? That it would help the family?" Claire's eyes welled up with tears, and her hands trembled as she tried to hold herself together. Henry moved around the table to hold her. "She wanted to use you," he whispered, his voice gentle. Claire nodded, her eyes filled with sadness. Henry felt a surge of anger welling up inside him. He clenched his jaw, but he forced himself to speak calmly. "I won't let her do this," he said, his voice gentle. "Claire, I promise you, I won't let her. She'll never hurt you again." Claire looked at him, her tear-streaked face showing a glimmer of relief. "You're not going to leave me?" "Of course not," he said, his voice firm and reassuring. When she had calmed down a little, Henry took her back to her friend's house and then drove home. In his mind, a plan was already taking shape. Sitting in the quiet of the living room, Henry replayed the events, thinking about the situation with a heavy heart. Margaret hadn't just betrayed him. She had dared to threaten the most precious thing they had, their daughter. He remembered the cigarette case left on the table and the man who had fled from their home. He knew he had to gather evidence, to leave Margaret no room for excuses or defense. A plan took shape in his mind, a plan that he knew would work. He wasn't just going to destroy her reputation. He was going to make sure she faced the consequences for everything. Henry decided it was time to act. The next morning, Henry woke up earlier than usual. The heavy rain drumming against the roof matched his mood. It felt like nature itself was in agreement with him. He had spent the night fine-tuning his plan until it was absolutely perfect. First, he needed evidence. Margaret couldn't have been careful enough. Her confidence in her own impunity had clearly grown a bit too big. He just needed to find the weak link, a small detail that would unravel all her carefully woven lies. Henry started by reaching out to an old friend, Michael Stanton. Michael was a private investigator who had helped him a few years back with a Navy case. "Mike, I need your help," he said when Michael picked up. "For you, always, Captain," Michael replied warmly. "Is it serious?" "As serious as it gets. I need to know everything about the people coming to my house and who my wife is meeting outside of it." "Got it. This is personal, isn't it?" "It's more than that," Henry said, his voice soft and warm. "And Mike, I really need this information quickly." "Understood. I'll start today." Henry hung up and gazed out the window at the dark sky. This was just the beginning. A few days later, Michael sent the first report. "Henry, this is a messy situation," he said when they met at a small cafe on the edge of town. Michael spread several photographs across the table. They showed Margaret leaving the house with different men, sometimes getting into cars that pulled up near their gates. "These guys," Michael pointed at one photo. "I've got some info linking them to illegal stuff." In this one, he tapped on an image of a man in a tailored suit holding Margaret by the waist as they entered a restaurant. Is probably her main benefactor. Benefactor? Henry raised an eyebrow. "This guy pays for everything. And in return—" Michael paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. "Let's just say Margaret isn't doing it just for the money." Henry's fists clenched, but he kept his face expressionless. "What else?" Michael pulled out a few more photos. These showed their daughter, Claire, sitting in a cafe with Margaret. In the background, one of the same men was visible. "Henry, she's involving the girl," Michael said quietly. "You need to act fast." Henry carefully returned the photographs to their envelope, leaving one behind on the table. It was a picture of Margaret with her benefactor. "She'll regret this, Mike. I'll make sure she pays for everything." Michael nodded, understanding that this was Henry's chance to seek retribution. The next day, Henry picked Claire up from her friend's house and took her to his sister's home in a nearby town. "You'll be safe here, sweetheart," he said, hugging her tightly. "What about you, Dad?" she asked, her big eyes filled with concern. "Don't worry about me. I'll take care of everything." When he returned home, Margaret was waiting for him in the living room, feigning calmness. "Henry, you could have at least told me you were taking Claire." "She's better off staying away from this house," he said, tossing the envelope with the photos onto the couch. Margaret took the envelope, opened it, and began looking through the photographs. Her face turned pale, but she quickly composed herself. "This doesn't prove anything," she said, her voice laced with a hint of coldness. "This is only the beginning, Margaret," he said, his voice quiet but serious. "I'm going to take everything from you. The house, the money, your reputation. You'll be left with nothing." She laughed. but there was fear in her laughter. "You can't do that." "We'll see," he said and walked out, leaving her alone with the photographs. The next day, Henry received an unexpected invitation. It came from a friend they had in common who wanted to meet with him. He even named the place, a private club in the city center, notorious for its shady clientele. Henry arrived right on time. His face remained calm, but inside, he was simmering with anger. He knew this wouldn't be a simple conversation. At the entrance, he was greeted by a security guard dressed in a sharp black suit. "This way," the guard said curtly, gesturing toward the staircase leading to the upper floor. Henry walked up, feeling the guard's gaze on his back. In a cozy, well-furnished room, the man was waiting for him. It was Miles Randolph, a prominent businessman with an impeccable public reputation and a history of behind-the-scenes dealings. "Captain Wilkins," Miles greeted him warmly with a faint smile. "I'm glad you accepted my invitation." Henry didn't say much, just sat down across from him, his eyes as cold as steel. "Let's get straight to the point," he said, crossing his arms over his chest. Miles nodded, lifting a glass of expensive cognac. "I understand that you're just trying to help, but I don't like it when people start poking their noses where they don't belong. You've been asking a lot of questions, digging into things you'd be better off leaving alone." Henry looked at him, his eyes narrowing, but he didn't say anything. "Henry, I'm worried about you. Your behavior could be dangerous, not just for you but for your daughter too." Those last words hit Henry like a blow to the chest, but he kept his composure. "Is that a threat?" he asked calmly. Miles gave him a slightly smirking look, looking at him over the rim of his glass. "I'm just trying to help, Captain. You should consider walking away." Henry felt the heat of anger rise in him, but he kept his cool. He understood that Miles was trying to intimidate him, but instead, it only strengthened his resolve. "I'm not interested in your advice," he said quietly, but his voice was as firm as a rock. Miles set his glass down on the table and leaned forward. "Listen, Captain, you're a good sailor, probably an honorable man. But in these waters, there's no way out. You'd be better off going back to your ship and forgetting all of this." "Go back?" Henry leaned in closer, staring directly into his opponent's eyes. "You're mistaken if you think I'll give up so easily." Miles laughed, but there was a hint of nervousness in his tone. "You've got guts, Captain, but I'm afraid this isn't a fight you can win." "You'd be surprised at what I'm capable of," Henry said, standing up. "Thanks for the advice." He turned and left, feeling Miles's gaze on his back as he walked away. Henry had no intention of stopping. Later that night, he met with Michael Stanton at a secure location to discuss the next phase of his plan. "Mike, this guy Miles Randolph thinks he can control everyone. I need proof of his shady dealings." Michael nodded, pulling a folder from his bag. "I've already got some leads. He's got his hands in a lot of different pies, like smuggling and arms dealing. He's got people in the port and customs. If we can expose them, we can hit his business hard. Let's get started." "I need every piece of evidence you can find," Henry said firmly. "Understood, Captain. Just be careful, okay? He already knows you're on to him." "Let him know," Henry said kindly. "The more he thinks he has the upper hand, the easier it will be to take him down." A few days later, Henry came home late at night. Standing on his doorstep was a stranger, a large man with a cold, piercing gaze. "Miles sends his regards," the man said before landing a punch. Henry barely managed to raise his arms to defend himself. The blow was heavy, but his years of Navy service had not been in vain. He pushed the attacker back and delivered a sharp elbow to his stomach. The man stumbled back, reaching for a knife, but Henry was ready. With a quick move, he took the attacker's knife and pushed him against the wall. "Tell Miles I'm not the kind of man who gives up," Henry said, staring directly into the man's eyes. The man hurriedly fled, leaving Henry alone. He gently touched the blood on his lip, thinking about how he could have stopped it, and then went back to the house. This was only the first in a series of challenges, but Henry was determined not to let it stop him. He knew that he had to do everything in his power to destroy Miles's life as thoroughly as Miles had destroyed his. Henry spent the entire night in a small study, unable to sleep. On his desk were documents from Michael and photos of Margaret. He looked closely at each page, slowly understanding the details that came together to paint a sad and clear picture. Margaret wasn't just a cheater. She had used him, his work, his trust. Through her benefactor, Miles Randolph, she had been passing confidential information about fleet movements and cargo, giving Randolph and his associates opportunities for smuggling and illegal deals. The most heartbreaking part was that, if exposed, all the evidence pointed back to Henry. His wife and her lover had been preparing to frame him, the Navy captain responsible for the safety of his crew and his country. That evening, Henry waited for the right moment to confront Margaret. She was sitting in the living room, lazily flipping through a magazine. She looked a bit off, as if she was putting on an act, and it really bothered him. He walked over and threw a folder of documents onto the table. "Read this," he said, his voice gentle but firm. Margaret glanced up, her expression slightly wary but still trying to maintain her composure. "What is this?" she asked, her voice a soft blend of surprise and concern. But her eyes locked on the photographs, and she felt a sudden freeze take hold of her. "Margaret, I need you to understand that these photographs show the truth. The truth about you and your benefactor. You used me to pass him information. Did you think I'd never find out?" Her face went pale, but she quickly collected herself. "I'm sorry, Margaret, but this proves nothing," she said, her voice a soft, cold whisper. "Nothing?" Henry moved closer, his voice low and serious. "These documents are linked to my official reports. You passed them on to him under my name, through my work. If this came to light, I'd be accused of treason." Margaret stood up, trying to sound confident. "You're overreacting. No one would have ever found out. It's just business." "Business?" he roared, his face turning red with rage. "You call this business? Selling me out? Selling our family? Selling our country for money?" She replied, her voice tinged with indignation. "Yes, for money. You were always so busy with your service. I got tired of being a shadow, of being the wife who's always second to your career. So you decided to become a—" He shot back, no longer holding back his words. Her eyes flashed with anger. "How dare you say that to me? You left me alone for months. What could I have done? Sit and pray?" "Oh, you should have," he said, taking a step toward her. But he stopped, forcing himself to regain control. "You've sunk to the lowest level." Her face showed her anger, but she didn't say anything, realizing that she had lost control of the situation. The next day, Henry decided it was time to put an end to it all. He returned home later than usual, deciding to check one last time. As he pulled into the driveway, he noticed a car parked outside the house. The moment he stepped inside, he heard laughter coming from upstairs. Climbing the stairs, he pushed open the bedroom door and caught Margaret with a young sailor who looked like he had no idea where to hide. "You again?" Henry called out cheerfully, his voice carrying through the house. The young man jumped up, fumbling to pull on his pants, but Henry wasn't about to wait. He hurried over and, with one swift punch, sent him to the floor. "Please, just get out of my house," Henry said, his voice gentle but firm. The young sailor groaned and scrambled out the door, leaving Margaret alone. "Henry, you're losing control," she said, her voice gentle. But he didn't listen. "Margaret, you've already lost everything. I'm done. You've destroyed everything we had." She didn't say a word, seeing the concern in his eyes. "Tomorrow, you'll pack your things and leave this house. I'm filing for divorce. Do you think you can just erase me from your life like that?" Her voice turned icy. "No," he said, taking a step toward the door. "I'll erase you from my life, and then I'll destroy yours." Henry knew that taking down Miles Randolph was the key to his revenge. He continued working with Michael, gathering the evidence needed to bring the criminal empire to its knees. Margaret would soon realize that her game was over. The morning was fresh and bright. It was early spring, a time when frost still clung to the ground at night, but the morning sun struggled to warm the air. A thin layer of frost glistened on the grass outside the house, while the horizon hinted at the warmth of the day to come. Henry sat in the living room with a cup of strong black coffee. The sunlight streaming through the windows cast a warm, golden glow on the room. He gazed at the bedroom door, waiting for Margaret to come out. The room felt quiet and still, and every little sound, like the creaks of the floorboards or the drip of water from the sink, seemed to carry more weight. When she finally appeared, her face was hard, her lips pressed tightly together. She was wearing her best coat, long in navy blue, as if she were preparing not to leave, but to attend an important meeting. In one hand, she held a travel bag, and in the other, her phone, clutched it like a final shield. "You think I'll just walk away like this?" Her voice was sharp, like the icy wind. "Yes, you will," Henry replied calmly, standing up from his chair. His gaze was as cold as the morning frost. "You've destroyed everything. This house is no longer yours." She placed her bag on the floor and took a step forward, her eyes blazing with emotion. "Henry, you're being so cruel. You've always been in need of help, Henry. You thought your uniform and your ships made you something more. You're nothing. And you're a liar," he said quietly, but there was more power in his words than in any shout. "And now you mean nothing." She laughed bitterly, but there was no joy in her laughter. "Do you think people will see you as a hero when the truth comes out? When I tell everyone who you really are?" "Say whatever you want," he replied, taking a step closer to her. "Margaret, please remember this. You'll never get near our daughter again." Her face turned pale. "You have no right," she shouted, her voice trembling. "I have every right," he replied calmly. "Because you lost yours, Margaret. You've lost everything." She grabbed her bag and headed for the door. "Henry Wilkins, you're a very naughty man," she exclaimed, turning back at the doorway. Henry didn't respond. The door closed with a loud bang, leaving the house completely silent. Later that morning, Henry met with Michael Stanton at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. The sun was shining brightly, and a gentle breeze blew, carrying the sweet scent of the earth and the promise of new growth. Michael was a tall, lean man with faded chestnut hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed especially perceptive. His face showed the signs of a long career: faint wrinkles, a few scars, and fine lines of tension around his mouth. He was wearing a well-loved leather coat and a light scarf tied in a knot that looked like a sailor's rope. "You look like you haven't slept all night," Michael said, nodding toward Henry as he approached the table. "I haven't had the time," Henry said, sitting across from him. "What do you have?" Michael pulled a folder from his briefcase and laid out several photographs. "We found where Miles's men gather. It's an old warehouse in the industrial district. They store documents there, and I think they might be storing weapons too. And that's not all. It's not just a base. It's where they conduct their business." "How many of them?" Henry asked, looking closely at the photos. "There are at least a dozen of them, and they're armed." Henry nodded. His jaw tightened in concern. "Good. Let's gather the team. We're going to take them down tonight." Michael gave a slight smile, but his eyes showed seriousness. "I know this is going to be dangerous, but I'm ready for it. I'm not one for easy paths, Mike." By evening, they had gathered near a van close to the warehouse. Henry looked around at the group: a few operatives, police officers in bulletproof vests, and Michael standing beside him, holding a radio in his hand. "We move fast," Henry whispered. "Take them alive if you can, but be ready for a fight." They entered the warehouse through the back door. Henry led the group, his heart pounding with excitement, but he kept his movements steady and precise. Inside, they heard the sound of hurried footsteps and shouting. A few men tried to flee, but our operatives subdued them quickly. Henry hurried into the main hall. There they saw several men around a table piled with boxes full of weapons. "Where is Miles?" he asked, his voice warm and firm. "We don't know what you're talking about," one of them began, but Henry stepped closer and grabbed him by the collar. "I won't repeat myself. Where is he?" "He's gone," another man shouted. "As soon as he heard you were coming, he disappeared." Henry let go of the man, releasing him with a deep breath. "Michael, please search everything. We need documents, anything connected to Miles," he said, stepping toward the exit. When the operation was over, Henry stood by his Jeep as his phone rang. An unknown number flashed on the screen. "Hello?" he asked, his voice warm and friendly. A calm, almost lazy voice came through the line. "Captain Wilkins, your persistence is impressive." Henry recognized the voice right away. "Miles," he said, his voice a soft murmur. "Hey, Miles, you still think you're on your ship, right? This is a different ocean, and it's far deeper than you can imagine." "I'll find you," Henry said, his voice warm with concern. "Good luck," Miles said, and then the call disconnected. Henry stared at the dark screen, his hand gripping the phone tightly. His expression hardened. "I'll find you," he thought again. Henry sat at the kitchen table, going over the materials they had collected. His trump card was powerful. Documents exposing Miles Randolph's and Margaret's scheme were ready to be handed over to the authorities. These papers had the power to not only tarnish Miles's reputation, but also risk landing him in prison for years. The phone lay next to him, and he tapped its screen nervously, waiting for Michael's signal. The operation was prepared, but everything depended on whether they could intercept Miles and Margaret before they disappeared for good. But everything was too quiet. Henry could feel it in his gut. the calm before the storm. Suddenly, the phone buzzed to life. Henry eagerly picked up the phone and saw Claire's name on the screen. "Dad!" Her voice was quivering with emotion. "Claire, what's wrong?" he asked, his heart racing. "Mom, she tried to find me. She called my friend, and then this man, he was following me." Her voice trembled, and Henry could hear the wind whipping through the phone. "What man? Where are you right now?" Henry stood, grabbing his jacket and keys. "I'm on the street near." Her voice faltered, and she whispered, "He's coming toward me." "Claire, please listen to me. Stay in a place where there are people around you, where you can be seen. I'm on my way. Just tell me exactly where you are." "Near the main park," she said, her voice cut off. "Claire? Claire!" Henry shouted, but the line went dead. He started his car with such force that passers-by turned to look. The tires screeched as he pulled onto the main road, his eyes glued to his phone as he repeatedly tried to call her back. But there was no answer. She said the park, he thought, and he drove toward the city's Central Park. His heart pounded with concern. He couldn't stop thinking about their conversation, and all the possible worst things that could happen flashed through his mind. Who was this man? Why had Margaret decided to look for Claire? It felt like a trap that Miles had been setting for a long time. He parked near the park entrance, leaving the engine running, and hurried inside. The park was big, but the evening paths were empty. "Claire!" he called out, his voice full of concern. But all he heard was the wind rustling through the trees. As he crossed path after path, scanning the dark corners, his eyes caught something on the ground. It was the same small bag he had bought for Claire on her birthday. Nearby was her phone, its screen cracked. Henry picked it up, his heart breaking. The bag was empty, with no wallet or other belongings inside. He felt angry, but he tried not to let it get to him. The park was still full of people, and Henry noticed a woman walking her dog nearby. "Excuse me," he said, holding up the phone and bag. "Did you happen to see a girl with these?" The woman hesitated, but then pointed toward a side path. "I saw some men calling out to her. At first, she tried to walk away, but they practically forced her to go with him, down there." "Thank you," Henry said warmly, and ran in the indicated direction. The path led him to an old exit from the park, an area usually quiet and peaceful. He saw a car parked with the engine still running. As he got closer, he took 2 steps, but then someone popped out of the shadows. "Going somewhere, Captain?" a familiar voice called out. It was one of Miles's men, grinning with a pistol in hand. "Where is my daughter?" Henry didn't flinch, his eyes burning with fury. "You're playing in the wrong league, Captain. Your girl. Maybe you'll find out if you behave. This is your last chance. Where is she?" Henry took a step forward, his voice gentle but firm. The man aimed the gun at him, his smirk widening. "Easy, sailor. We've got some business to take care of with you and the girl. She's part of the deal." Henry felt his fists clench. He saw another man step out of the car, overhearing their whispered conversation. "They're trying to stall," Henry thought. He took a step back, letting them think he was retreating, but his eyes remained sharp, searching for any clue about Claire's whereabouts. "Hey, we can make a deal," Henry said, trying to buy some time. "You know who I am." But then, the second man opened the car's trunk, revealing it was empty. "Enough talk, Captain. We have a message for you from Miles." Suddenly, a gunshot rang out, and one of the men crumpled, hit by a hidden attacker. It was Michael, arriving just in time with his backup team. Things got a little crazy. Henry seized the moment, drawing his pistol and joining the fight. His mind was on one thing: finding Claire. Miles's men were well prepared, but Henry, Michael, and the operatives moved quickly. Bullets whizzed through the air, and shouts echoed between the walls. With each step, Henry inched closer to the truth. At one point, Henry found himself face to face with the man who had threatened him earlier. The man dropped his gun, realizing he had no chance of escape. "Where is my daughter?" he asked, his voice cracking with emotion. Henry's voice was low and measured, and he gently guided the man to the wall. The man began to reply, but he faltered. Henry punched him hard in the jaw, making him cough. "Please, tell me where my daughter is." "I'll let you go," Henry said, his voice gentle. "She's with your wife," the man managed, trying to shield his face. "There, with Miles." Those words hit Henry harder than any blow. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice cracking with emotion. "On a yacht. Miles is taking them." Henry didn't wait to hear more. He gently pushed the man out of the way and hurried to Michael, who was safely concealed at the opposite end of the hall. "Michael, they have a yacht. They're planning to escape by water. We have the coordinates of his private dock. Let's move, Captain." The dock was surrounded by water, glistening in the moonlight. Henry, Michael, and the operatives crept toward the massive white yacht where preparations for departure were already underway. Henry spotted Margaret on the upper deck. She was standing with her arms crossed, and beside her was Miles, who appeared to be giving her last-minute instructions. Henry's heart fluttered when he noticed Claire in the corner. She looked frightened but unharmed. "Armed. Waiting on your signal, Captain," Michael said quietly, taking cover behind a crate of equipment. "I'll take care of them," Henry said, taking a steadying breath. He gripped his pistol tightly. The operation began swiftly. The team stormed the yacht, disarming the guards. Henry made his way to the upper deck, where Margaret and Miles were. "Miles, I'm right here. Don't worry," Henry said, his voice warm and reassuring. Miles, seeing him, pulled out a gun, but Henry fired first, knocking the weapon from his hand. "This is the end," Henry said, aiming his pistol directly at Miles. "Do you think you've won?" Miles gave a playful smirk. "We've gone too far for that." Henry wasn't listening, though. His eyes met Margaret's, who was shyly standing behind Miles. "Did you really think you could escape with this scum?" He looked at her with a kind smile, but also with a hint of sadness. "Where is your motherly love? Where is your honor?" Margaret pressed her lips together, but her eyes burned with anger. "You never understood, Henry. You never knew how to truly live." "Live? You call this living? You sold out our family. You were ready to sell your own daughter." Those words left her speechless. "You don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice trembling. "Margaret, I need you to tell me the truth," Henry said, his voice a soft blend of concern and warning. "Margaret, did you plan to hand Claire over to Miles to save your pathetic existence?" "You don't understand anything," she screamed. "I wanted her to be happy. She could have had a life she could only dream of." "Happy?" Henry laughed, but it was empty. "You call it happiness? You were going to sell her like a piece of property. You just don't get it, do you?" Margaret whispered. "She deserves better than your unhappy life as a captain." At that moment, Claire, who had been standing in the corner, suddenly shouted, "You're lying! I hate you, Mom." Those words stung Margaret, but Henry didn't give her a chance to respond. "Look at her, Margaret," he said quietly. "This is all you have left, your daughter's hatred." He gestured to Michael, and the operatives gently subdued Miles and Margaret. When it was over, Henry embraced Claire, feeling her trembling in his arms. "It's over now, sweetheart," he whispered, stroking her hair. After Miles and Margaret were apprehended, the operatives began investigating the confiscated documents. It turned out that Miles had built an entire empire on smuggling and selling information, including classified naval movements. His profits were in the tens of millions of dollars, and he had a network of accomplices spanning multiple countries. Margaret wasn't just a lover and pawn for Miles. She had been his intermediary, using Henry as a cover to pass along sensitive information. This detail became a crucial piece of evidence when the case went to trial. The trial was a big deal, and the public was eager to know more. Margaret was charged with complicity in smuggling and treason. Her lawyers tried to shift the blame onto Miles, but the evidence collected by Henry and Michael was undeniable. During his testimony, Henry said, "My only fault was being too consumed by duty and trusting someone who betrayed me." His words resonated deeply with the public, earning him widespread sympathy. Margaret was sentenced to 15 years in prison, despite her tears and attempts to plead for mercy. Her actions had led to her downfall, and it was heartbreaking to see the impact of her scheming and betrayal. Miles, the mastermind behind the operation, received a life sentence. His wealth was confiscated, and his network dismantled. After the trial, Henry retired from the Navy. His service and the courage he demonstrated in taking down Miles were widely recognized. He was awarded a medal for his service to the nation, and a formal ceremony was held in his honor, attended by his comrades and friends. During this ceremony, his commander said, "Henry is not only devoted to his country, but he has shown that honor and justice always prevail." For Henry, it was a moment of pride and the final chapter of his military career. He and Claire moved to a quaint little cottage by the sea, a cozy home surrounded by pine trees with a view of the vast ocean Henry had always loved. Claire enrolled in university, choosing to study psychology. She finally felt safe, living with a father who had always been her anchor. Every morning, Henry would step onto the shore with a cup of coffee, enjoying the peace. "What's the plan for today, Dad?" Claire would ask as they sat down for breakfast. "I think I'll bake a pie, and you can help me," he would reply with a warm smile. His days were filled with simple joys: fishing, reading, and long walks with his daughter. No more secrets, no more intrigues, just the peaceful life he had earned. Henry found his peace. His name became a symbol of honor and courage, and his life with Claire was a testament to how love and loyalty could overcome even the greatest challenges. His story ended where it had begun, by the sea, which had always been his home. Now, he could finally be at peace, just a father and a man, free from the weight of the past.